Welcome everyone to the online educator series. This is Module 7 on Improved Forest Management and Challenges. I am Margarita Fernandez, a postdoctoral scholar at the Ecosystem Science and Management Department at Penn State. Today we will explore how improved forest management practices are implemented at the stand level. We will take a closer look at the role of individual landowners in shaping these practices, how their values influence decision making, and some of the key challenges they face along the way. In our last module, we talked about increasing basal area through delayed harvest. But you might be wondering, what about the landowners and their values? That's exactly what we'll dig into today. Let's imagine a landowner who wants to achieve a specific mix of age classes or tree density. One of the most common objectives among forest landowners is managing wildlife and wildlife habitat. And as you know, habitat needs vary depending on the species of interest. It's all about the right combination of age classes and structural complexity. So, the big question is, how do we reconcile carbon-focused management goals with these other landowners' priorities? That's what we will be exploring throughout today's session. I'm currently leading a literature review to explore how stem-level forest management can support additional carbon storage. My work focuses on how understanding the existing forest structure and current management practices can help us identify opportunities to enhance carbon outcomes. Essentially, I'm asking, what does improved forest management actually look like in practice? To simplify this discussion, I break it down into two broad categories, even age and uneven age stands. Now, that's not always a perfect distinction, especially here in Pennsylvania. While our forests are largely natural and may appear uneven age, we have to remember the widespread clear cuts that occurred around the turn of the 20th century. So much of our regrowth is functionally even age, even if it doesn't look like a plantation. But this breakdown helps us think more clearly about how structure influences carbon outcomes. Let's start with uneven age stands. Research shows that high grading, where only the largest, most valuable trees are harvested, can reduce long-term carbon storage by up to 40% compared to more sustainable management. Reducing high grading and using individual tree selection instead can significantly enhance carbon retention, especially in warmer regions where primary productivity is naturally higher. Rather than avoiding harvest altogether, strategic interventions, such as thinning from below or selectively opening the canopy, can actually improve growing conditions. This helps boost tree growth, increase basal area, and enhance overall stand productivity. Even the frequency of harvest matters less when removals are aligned with long-term sustainability goals. We also need to watch for low stock stands, which tend to have a lower structural complexity and in turn reduce carbon sequestration potential. In Pennsylvania, one key driver of poor stocking is deer browse, which limits regeneration. So, understanding current stocking levels and what's affecting regeneration is critical to forecasting future carbon potential. Now, for even stands, shifting from clear cutting to a shelterwood approach where a few mature high-quality trees are retained, can help maintain more carbon in the landscape. This practice not only seeds the next generation, but keeps total carbon stocks slightly higher than a complete removal would. Interestingly, out in warmer regions, even age management can sometimes outperform uneven age management and strategies for carbon sequestration. The takeaway here is that regional context matters. Forest type, site productivity, regeneration challenges, and baseline carbon levels all play a role in determining what improvement means. At the end of the day, it's about understanding your stand, your region, and your management baseline. Then, making targeted changes to move the needle on carbon. A baseline is used to measure the initial carbon storage of the stand before management. You can refer to Module 4 for a more in-depth discussion about baselines. Of challenges in this space that are hard to discuss in general terms, because nothing is ever completely simple or universal. Every forest and every landowner is different, and there are always exceptions. One core challenge is accurately estimating carbon stocks. If we only measure board feet to calculate carbon, we miss what's stored in the branches, roots, and potentially waste material. That gives us an incomplete picture. Another challenge is spatial variation. Forest structure and composition change across the landscape, and while permanent plots are useful, they are limited in scope. This is where remote sensing can play a major role, allowing us to gather more consistent data across larger areas. And then there's the question of how carbon management interacts with other landowner objectives. These goals often depend on things like age class and tree density. So when we try to predict how carbon-focused practices will affect management decisions, we have to consider how much those decisions are tied to these structural variables. If a landowner is trying to create more forage for wildlife, they might actually prefer more open areas and early successional growth, the kind of habitat you often see after a major disturbance. Especially true for some game species that thrive in those conditions. On the other hand, there are species that prefer denser stands for cover and protection, so the preferred structure really depends on the wildlife species being prioritized, and just as importantly, on how the landowner plans to use the habitat. If hunting is one of their goals, they may want to maintain clearance where it's easier to spot and track game like deer or turkey. That brings in considerations about the layout and size of the property, and what kind of experiences they want to have in their hand. Which leads to an important question: where does carbon storage fit in? Is it a top priority, or does it take a backseat to wildlife, recreation, or timber goals? Understanding that balance is key when thinking about carbon-focused management. It really comes down to priorities. If carbon management starts to conflict with other landowner goals, like wildlife habitat, timber income, or recreation, the big question is, where does carbon rank? Will they prioritize carbon storage, or will I take a backseat to something else? When it comes to offset projects, at some point you're going to be working with averages, especially when setting a baseline. But that raises some important challenges. First, carbon stocks and individual properties often differ from the regional average. So if a landowner forest already stores more carbon than the average at the time of enrollment, is it fair to say that they're adding that much more carbon? Probably not. On the flip side, if their carbon stock is below average when they enroll, does a baseline overstate the potential gains? This question matters, especially if payments are tied to the amount of carbon stored above that baseline. So how we define average has real implications for fairness and accuracy in these projects. If a landowner is getting paid per ton of carbon, then the baseline really matters. It's the foundation for calculating additional storage. But if the payment structure is different, say a flat rate or a cost share, then using an average baseline might be good enough. It really depends on what's being prioritized and how accountable the project developer is in making sure those carbon estimates are as accurate as possible. Now, another critical factor in these projects is something called the likelihood of harvest or risk of harvest. The idea is that if a harvest is delayed or avoided altogether, that delay results in more carbon being stored. But here's the challenge. How do we know when a landowner will have harvest? That decision may not follow any predictable pattern. Some owners might harvest only once, during a specific window that fits their needs, rather than responding to broader trends or incentives. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of landowners may harvest decisions based on personal needs, what we will call needs-based decision-making. They might only conduct one large harvest during their entire period of ownership, maybe with a few thinnings along the way. But when that exactly will that happen? It's hard to predict. Offset projects often try to estimate the risk of harvest using indicators like stumpage price or distance to mills. The assumption is that if prices are high or mills are nearby, harvest is more likely. But research shows that landowners aren't necessarily driven by these economic signals. In fact, many aren't very responsive to changes in stumpage price or meal distance at all when deciding whether or not to harvest. So using those factors to model behavior can be misleading. To wrap things up, today we look at the complexity of estimating carbon in a forest system and why it matters. Current estimates are not just snapshots of current conditions, they're also predictions of future states, future management decisions, and what will have happened under a business as usual scenario versus an improved forest management alternative. What gives us estimates real value is the level of confidence behind them. It's not just about the market value of a carbon credit, it's about how much that credit is trusted. That trust matters to landowners, project developers, and the broader public. Some forest features like tree volume can be measured with a high degree of confidence because we have been doing it for decades. But other carbon pools like dead wood, soil organic carbon, or forest floor litter are harder to assess and manage. These components are an uncertainty, and that uncertainty affects how much carbon outcomes are perceived and valued. At the end of the day, it's not just about measuring carbon, it's about understanding which part of the forest we can manage well, how confident we are in those measurements, and what it means for the integrity of carbon projects moving forward. If there's one key takeaway from today's presentation, is this. Improved forest management isn't about achieving one ideal forest structure. It's about understanding the current condition, what's business as usual, and asking how management can meaningfully shift that trajectory. It starts by knowing what the stand looks like now. Then we ask, what would have happened without intervention? What activities are typically conducted in this region? And how can we adjust that baseline to create a real improvement? So my challenge to you is, think about your client's forest. What's the structure? What's the history of management in that area? Because understanding what's typical, what's normal, is the foundation for identifying and justifying improved practices. That's how we get to meaningful, credible carbon outcomes. So some reflection questions I have for you are, how do your clients done a standing inventory of any kind? Could they be using some of these lookup charts as a proxy so they get a sense of the carbon potential? And of course, what are the management objectives? Age, class, or tree density dependent? This is one that's pretty important when they decide if they want to get into a carbon incentives program. So it depends on how they value their forest and what they're trying to achieve. So overall, while there are still challenges in measuring carbon potential and engaging landowners, there are also a lot of exciting work happening in this space. We encourage you to reflect on the questions we discussed toward the end of today's session so you can tailor your approach and guidance to your audience's specific context. If you're watching this video on YouTube, we encourage you to check out our free online educator course. If you're taking the course, here are a few reminders for you. Feel free to put any questions in the Q&A forum on the classroom page. Remember to fill out the survey if you want credits and to complete the comprehension check. I will see you next time.